Welcome, everyone, wherever you're joining us today, and welcome to all viewers from
Bonjour, bonsoir à tous et à toutes, d'où que vous vous connectiez. Je sais que vous êtes connectés du monde entier. Je m'appelle Martine Karadjov, il, lui. Je préside le comité directeur jeunesse, ILGA, et je participe aussi, je suis aussi membre du réseau Métro, réseau d'associations queer de jeunes internationales. Je suis très heureux d'être votre hôte lors de cette conversation du jour. Conversation organisée par le bureau de l'envoyé spécial de la jeunesse des Nations Unies. Il s'agit de l'expert indépendant chargé de la protection contre la violence et la discrimination liée à l'orientation et identité du genre et Ilga Monde qui organise donc cette conversation. Nous allons inviter un certain nombre d'intervenants à parler de différentes initiatives dans lesquelles ils sont impliqués. L'objectif est donc de permettre la participation politique des jeunes LGBTIQ au niveau mondial, local, international. Je voudrais que vous puissiez partager votre propre expérience en tant que jeune LGBTIQ impliqué dans l'arène politique et qu'est-ce qui a permis que vous puissiez vous impliquer dans ce domaine. Nous allons aussi réfléchir aux différentes barrières, aux obstacles qui se posent à l'accès des jeunes LGBTIQ dans le monde. Avant de commencer, donc il y a des questions de logistique, bien sûr, vous y êtes habitués. Nous disposons d'interprétations simultanées vers le français et l'espagnol. Vous pouvez choisir la langue de votre choix. Vous allez trouver les instructions dans le chat, dans la boîte de discussion. Et si vous rencontrez des problèmes techniques lors de cette réunion, vous pourrez utiliser l'option questions-réponses. C'est accessible et nous pourrions donc vous aider si vous vous y exprimez. Tous les participants, en dehors des intervenants, auront leur caméra micro éteint pour leur protection. Donc les questions que nous allons partager ont été soumises par des jeunes qui se sont inscrits à cette manifestation. Nous allons donc utiliser ces questions pour notre dialogue. Nous allons les poser aux intervenants. Merci à tous et à toutes pour vos contributions jusqu'ici. N'hésitez pas à poser des questions aussi dans la boîte de discussion et par le biais des questions-réponses, cette fonctionnalité. Avant que nous ne démarrions, j'aimerais projeter une vidéo qui vous explique de quoi fait partie cette manifestation. Elle s'inscrit dans une série de manifestations donc, que nous organisons avec l'envoyé spécial de l'ONU et ILGA Monde. Donc, nous allons projeter
Hello,
cette
Diagwit.
vidéo.
My name is
Oscar,
Oscar. My pronouns are
allez-y.
he, him, his, and I am a consultant
Je
for the Global Queer
m'appelle
Youth Network on
Oscar.
behalf of ILGA World.
Il,
And
lui,
together with my team,
consultant
we are
pour
helping turn conversation into
du
action.
membre du réseau
Young
ILGA. Avec mon équipe, nous
LGBTIQ
faisons en
plus
sorte que les
people face
conversations deviennent
different
des actions.
threats to their freedoms
Les
because of who they
jeunes
are, who they love, and the activism that they
LGBTIQ+,
do. Despite this, they
rencontrent des
organize,
menaces
mobilize,
différentes à
and
leur
continuously advocate for
liberté à cause de
change.
qui ils sont, qui ils aiment et leur
LGBTIQ
militantisme, à
plus
cause de ce qu'ils
youth play
font.
a
Donc,
key
en
role in the
dépit de ça, ils
achievement of the
s'organisent,
2030
mobilisent
agenda
et
and
font
the
un plaidoyer
UN's
pour le
first ever
changement.
system-wide
Ces
youth
jeunes jouent un
strategy,
rôle
Youth
essentiel pour la
2030 for queer
réalisation
people.
du programme 2030
But to realize
et
change, the
pour
challenges that we face
la
need to be
stratégie des Nations Unies
recognized,
pour la jeunesse,
accepted, and
jeunesse
meaningfully
2030
integrated
pour
into the
les
work of the
jeunes
United
queer.
Nations,
Mais pour le
governments, and
changement,
the
ces
international
défis doivent
development
être
community at
reconnus,
large.
acceptés et
That is
intégrés
why the
dans le
Office of the
travail des
Secretary
Nations Unies,
General's
dans
Envoy on
des
Youth, the
gouvernements
UN
et de la
Independent
communauté du
Experts
développement
on
international.
Protection
C'est pour
Against
cela
Violence
que
and
l'envoyé
Discrimination
spécial
Based on
du
Sexual
secrétaire
Orientation and
général pour
Gender
la
Identity,
jeunesse,
ILGA
l'expert
World, and the
indépendant aussi
Global
des
Queer
Nations
Youth
Unies,
Network have
ILGA
launched the
Monde
Queer
et
Youth
le réseau
Dialogues,
mondial
a
des jeunes
year-long
queer ont
campaign
lancé
aimed
donc
at
ces
building
dialogues
stronger global
des
youth
jeunes
movement
queer,
for
donc une campagne
LGBTIQ
d'un
plus
an
human
qui
rights.
vise à renforcer
The dialogues
les
will be fully
mouvements
online
mondiaux
and will
des
include different
jeunes
kinds of events, including panel discussions
LGBTIQ
and training
sur la
sessions on
protection de la personne.
networking,
Il y
strategy,
aura donc
capacity building,
des
and
événements
opportunities
en
to celebrate
ligne,
our
des
identity and
discussions de
culture, of
panel, des
course.
formations, le
Through the
réseautage, la
dialogues,
stratégie.
we
Nous
will
allons
be able
également
to
nous
build our
célébrer, célébrer
capacities
notre
and
identité,
influence
notre culture.
meaningful,
Par le biais
long-term
de ces
change,
dialogues, nous allons
especially at
pouvoir mettre
regional
en
and
place
global levels.
renforcer nos capacités et
Across the
influencer
UN
sur le
system
long
and with
terme
governments, the dialogues will
les
seek to
stratégies
enhance
au
and
niveau
promote
régional et
the human
mondial.
rights of LGBTIQ plus youth
Dans le système des
and
Nations
strengthen
Unies, au
structures to
niveau des
allow for our
gouvernements, ces
meaningful
dialogues
participation.
vont avoir pour
If you
objectif
want to know more
de
about the upcoming
promouvoir les
sessions
droits
and how
humains
to
des
engage, follow us on
LGBTIQ+. Si vous
Twitter
voulez avoir
at
plus d'informations quant à ces
GlobalQueerYN.
séances à venir,
And if
suivez-nous
you're
sur
interested
Twitter,
in joining the Queer Youth
@globalqueer,
Dialogues, let's turn some
YN. Et si vous
conversations
souhaitez
into
participer
action.
à ces dialogues, eh bien, il faut vous apprêter donc à faire en sorte que ces conversations deviennent des actions.
Great. Hopefully you got a better understanding of the queer youth dialogues that will be
En
happening.
espérant que vous avez pu ainsi comprendre ces dialogues de la jeunesse queer qui sont en cours. Il y en aura beaucoup, beaucoup d'autres. Il y en aura beaucoup d'autres dans les mois à venir. Si vous n'êtes pas encore enregistré, vous pouvez encore le faire. Nous allons discuter de différentes initiatives qui ont permis la participation des jeunes queer au niveau local et national et international. Pour la première partie de la discussion du jour, nous allons nous focaliser sur les initiatives qui ont un impact, qui sont importantes. Nous allons nous appesantir plus sur la participation des jeunes LGBTIQ. Je me réjouis de la prochaine partie de cette discussion. Nous allons avoir deux intervenants très intéressants qui viennent de deux organisations extraordinaires qui font un travail formidable en termes de diversité et inclusion et sur la participation politique de poids des LGBTIQ au niveau global et régional. Je leur demanderai de se présenter. En commençant par Andrew. Rapidement, si vous pouvez vous présenter. Je m'appelle Andrew. Lui, je travaille pour le Global Equality Caucus, qui est un réseau international d'élus, de parlementaires qui appuie l'égalité des LGBTIQ. Je suis aussi un chercheur au niveau du réseau parlementaire et je fais partie du comité LGBTIQ au niveau du Parlement britannique. Merci Andrew. Maintenant Charles. J'avais oublié d'ouvrir mon micro. Je m'appelle Charles Chauvel. Lui. Je travaille pour le Programme des Nations Unies pour le développement, le PNUD. Nous avons à peu près 65 pays partenaires de par le monde et nous y travaillons au renforcement d'une représentation inclusive. Nous travaillons auprès de parlements. J'ai été député en Nouvelle-Zélande et l'une des parties importantes de ce travail, ça a été d'autonomiser, de renforcer les parlementaires qui n'étaient pas inclusifs, notamment pour ce qui est des femmes, jeunes, LGBTIQ et d'autres populations clés. Nous voulions faire en sorte qu'ils puissent comprendre l'importance d'un Parlement qui ressemble aux personnes que l'on représente. Je vous en parlerai un petit peu plus lors de cette séance et je pourrai répondre aussi à vos questions. Merci à vous deux. J'attends avec intérêt cette discussion. Vos deux organisations, que ce soit Global Equality Caucus ou le PNUD, ont eu à travailler dans le sens d'une meilleure représentation, plus équitable des LGBTIQ. Pour ce qui est des minorités comme les LGBTIQ jeunes, on est souvent limité. On a souvent un rôle de vitrine dans la représentation dans différents espaces. J'aimerais donc commencer par cette question que nous avons reçue de certains participants aujourd'hui. Donc, quels sont certains obstacles qui empêchent les minorités, y compris les personnes LGBTIQ, à s'impliquer dans la politique et à se porter candidat au niveau local, au niveau régional? Est-ce qu'il y a des défis qui sont particuliers à la jeunesse? Je répète. Quels sont les obstacles qui empêchent les minorités, y compris les LGBTIQ, de s'impliquer dans la politique, de se porter candidat? Et quels sont les défis spécifiques pour la jeunesse? On commencera par vous, Andrew. Je dirais d'abord que la représentation compte. Et donc, si les jeunes LGBTIQ regardent leurs élus au niveau national et qu'ils ne voient pas de LGBTIQ parmi ces personnes, eh bien, ils estimeront que ce n'est pas pour eux. L'absence de représentation peut être due à un certain nombre de raisons. Dans certains pays, le contexte général n'est pas...
But it could be down to personal reasons as well. I mean, the public means that some people may struggle to come out, especially in an age of social media as well. They may feel like they are exposed to any number of judgments or prejudices which may not have they may not have been exposed to previously. But I should also say that it's getting better. The Global Equality Caucus has got members on every single continent, even in countries where the situation may not be particularly favourable. We have allies as well who are representing their issues. But we're also seeing that it's young people driving the diversity in elected office. So in the United Kingdom, for example, in the last election, we saw a record number of LGBT representatives elected, and a lot of them were under 35. We've also seen the same in state elections and local elections in the United States. A lot of LGBT representation has been driven by young people. In New Zealand as well, Poland, and we need to concentrate now more on making sure that intersectional issues are being addressed and represented. So a lot of the representation we're seeing has been driven by gay men, especially in the past. So we now need to think about what are the barriers that are stopping trans people from getting elected, what are the barriers that are stopping LGBT people of colour from seeking elected office, LGBT women as well, what are the factors that are stopping women seeking elected office? And just to throw a couple out there, some of those issues may be prejudice in certain communities that are stopping people from accessing political campaigns at the grassroots level. There may be additional health challenges that are stopping certain demographics from seeking elected office. Homelessness, which is one that does particularly affect young people and LGBT youth in particular. And then, of course, the financial cost of running for office as well. So that it can cost thousands and thousands of pounds to seek elected office. And that may be money that young people just don't have. So I'm sorry, I'll let Charles speak now.
Well, look, first of all, it's a great question. Second of all, Andrew, it's great to have had the Global Equality Caucus appear on the scene. I know how much work's gone into putting that coalition together, and having an organised group of international parliamentarians and other elected officials means that it's just so much easier for agencies like mine and others who want to advance inclusion to actually work with partners such as your organisation. So for anybody who doesn't know the work of the caucus, find out about it. It's been incredibly important so far for LGBTI legislators around the world and hopefuls to know that they're not alone and that they have places where they can exchange knowledge and get support. So I think that's probably my starting point. It can be a very lonely journey. And if you don't have that sort of support and that ability to refresh your resilience when you need it, it can be a very, very lonely road. Andrew mentioned the New Zealand Parliament, and it's one of the most LGBTI friendly in the world. But that wasn't always the case. MSM acts were criminalised in my country until 1986. So, that's probably evidence of both how rapidly things can change when you've got a group of people who want to change things, LGBTI people and our allies, but also how, as Andrew said, that's not always the case. You still have many places around the world where the legal environment is simply prohibitive as far as getting into office is concerned. And I suppose that I thought everything that Andrew said was absolutely on point and right. I'd probably just add two additional points. The first is, political parties are often the gatekeepers to managing to get into a representative institution like a parliament. And so if you haven't done the work with the parties themselves, if there's not real pressure on political parties from civil society and elsewhere to ensure that they are friendly and understand the need to be inclusive of all people in society, then that is going to be a problem and a barrier to entry. And I guess the other point, which is probably quite self-evident, is as Helen Clark, who was a former Prime Minister of New Zealand and a former administrator of UNDP, once said in the context of women's representation. Nobody ever invited us in to try to do something about the glass ceiling. We had to kick it in ourselves. So, organising and dealing with the phenomenon of majoritarianism and the way that it tends to reflect, preserve, and continue existing power structures and majorities is a real issue for us. We have to be very smart, have really good understanding of the way the systems work and the ability of how to change them and how to keep working with our allies to do so.
Thank you both as well for your reflections. And I'm speaking as well, you already kind of touched into the next question that I was going to ask you about, particularly looking some of the key players and how you mentioned, Charles, how like political parties can be gatekeepers and can be barriers rather than sometimes the facilitations of driving change around representation. So we heard as well about the diverse challenges LGBTIQ people face, and it was really importantly mentioned by you, Andrew, as well, that within our community the challenges are so diverse, and often we're like put together as one group and like look into how like, oh, these are the barriers that particularly LGBTIQ community face, when in reality, if you unpack the representation within our movement as well is problematic, and it lacks certain communities and certain voices as well. So my question to you, I'll come back to you, Andrew, now, is that what are some of the examples of strategies being implemented to promote greater representation of LGBTIQ people in formal politics, and maybe some particular ones that you can bring from your work that you already kind of touched upon as well, briefly?
Sure. I'll pick up on something that Charles said about political parties. So in many countries, it is the case that political parties have their own LGBT wings or LGBT networks. So in terms of formal institutions, joining one of those is a great way to get involved. In circumstances where LGBT wings don't exist, a lot of political parties often have youth wings. So even though they may not be dealing with LGBT issues specifically, a youth wing will be a great way to sort of get involved in certain advocacy campaigns and to support other people looking to sort of cross that barrier into formal politics. We also work with NGOs. So an NGO that we work with is the Victory Institute, and they do a lot of great work, particularly across the Americas, in providing support to young people that are seeking elected office. So they offer financial support, advice in the pipeline, and right through until those LGBT people find elected office. In terms of specific campaigns that we have been working on, we have recently been connecting people digitally on a web series called Lawmakers for LGBT Equality, where we've been bringing in activists and civil society workers on LGBT issues and connecting them with LGBT politicians to discuss some of the issues that are facing people in different regions of the world. And we hope to be continuing those discussions outside of the other end of the pandemic and connecting people in person, hopefully.
Yeah, and I think what I would say on this, UNDP and Parliamentarians for Global Action put together a handbook for parliamentarians on LGBTI rights and inclusion about 5 years ago, and we're just working on a reissue now. And we identified 6 or 7 arguments or entry points to use with parliamentarians who really weren't familiar with the issues and needed to do some thinking about it, to work on their own country's legal and social frameworks on inclusiveness. And I think they're the same, the entry points and the groups that kind of are represented in them are many of the same ones that we need to kind of work to build coalitions with. First of all, there's a basic human rights issue involved in proper representation of all people, irrespective of any kind of legal or social barriers. So, a parliament should look like its population, and human rights groups and development groups should champion that principle wherever they actually sit. If we are going to achieve human development goals, especially after the terrible setback from COVID that we've experienced in that regard, we need everybody in society to be not only represented, but feel that they've got a stake in society and that they want to be involved and contribute. And the best way to, prevent that from happening is to arbitrarily exclude certain groups. So again, there's an important argument that can be made here to any group in society that's pro-inclusion. Business is also an important ally. In many of the partner countries where we work, where there's a difficult legal environment, you'll often find, particularly in foreign-run businesses, where the top management has no stake in trying to exclude people. It just wants the best and most talented staff it can get. This is an argument that if you kind of run it properly with people who want productive businesses, they'll understand. I think I've mentioned political parties, but those that get inclusion right can often have an electoral advantage that's worth talking to them about if they don't get that. And finally, I would add, given the profusion of homophobic hate speech and online violence that we are seeing at the moment, tech platforms and new media are a really important potential ally here. We have to work with them to make sure that they're weeding out this sort of content so it doesn't just keep perpetuating. And we need to make sure that positive images, accurate images of people in our communities are presented by them on those platforms.
Thank you both as well. And I think, speaking of the alliances, and you both mentioned briefly, Charles, about the pandemic and how COVID has exacerbated, we know, the inequalities LGBTIQ people face. And particularly, we've seen as well how young people have been, queer young people in particular, have been further marginalized and excluded from the decision-making, not only on global level, but even locally as well. We know that young people as well face multiple barriers to access service provision, and including LGBT service provision in their own countries during the pandemic. And a lot of the services that they were fully relying on became non-existent. So my question here is that we know that COVID has presented these additional challenges for overall for LGBTIQ communities and representation. But what do you think maybe can be done during the pandemic to use this time to bring these bridges with different organizations? You, Charles, mentioned which are some of the key organizations that we should focus on, such as the media, such as political parties. But what are the other priorities we need to focus on in terms of partners, in terms of others that we need to be able to include that representation of LGBTIQ people in this time, especially when their voices are missing around the table?
Do you want me to?
Yes, perhaps? Yeah, because I mentioned you. So
okay. We hear a lot about tipping points and turning points and key decision points. I think recovery from COVID, if it's done properly and inclusively, could represent, actually our last best hope for a whole range of things, from the climate crisis through to promoting better inclusion and equality and prosperity across the board. And I think, the most horrible thing I can imagine for this planet and for everybody who lives on it would be if, after having gone through what we've gone through with COVID, not only, and not to minimize them, the deaths and the hospitalizations, the economic and social setbacks, the exclusion of the most marginalized that you've just referred to, if we go through all of that, and then, once we recover whatever that looks like. We just go back to the old ways of working, you know. Polluter does what it does to get away with. Very, very wealthy people get away with, you know, extraordinarily lavish lifestyles, while people who don't have anything are struggling to get by. LGBTI people, you know, suffering all the sort of violence and exclusion and difficulties that we all know about and have lived in our own lives. If we simply allow all these bad old ways to persist, you know, then we'll have gone through this crisis for nothing, and those who have suffered so much will have gone through it for nothing. And you know, I suspect that frankly, we'll have a pretty doomed planet. So, you know, I think again, we UNDP have been working with parliaments and parliamentarians on a project that we call Building Forward Better, and the theme of it is, you know, you as parliamentarians need to take power and insist on your role as representatives of the people, to require your governments to partner with you to state what their vision is for building forward better, so this hasn't all been a waste of time. And that has to be an inclusive vision, and it has to be a sustainable vision, and it has to be a vision that honours people's human rights and dignity and ability to participate to the fullest in society as we go forward. So, you know, I hope this just becomes more than an argument or a debate or a dialogue in the echo chambers of the United Nations. It would be great if we got much more debate and dialogue in the media, in civil society, in parliaments themselves, everywhere possible, you know, demanding that that we live differently from now on and learn from the mistakes that have been laid so bare by COVID and the way we were living before.
Thank you, Charles. And same question to you, Andrew, about, again, in the framework of recovery. And, you know, and we hear a lot about building better as well, but often this conversation are missing the LGBTIQ voices. And we're not seeing, as, you know, we're risking as well of seeing another generation of queer young, for example, completely excluding from the decision-making that we should not be doing. And I know that your organization is global, and you have regional perspectives as well from it, from the different, with the lawyers and also the political leaders that you work with. So from your side as well, it's like, what are the priorities and what are the key alliances that we should be building in the times of this? And as Charles mentioned, what are the key lessons that we should not be, with the key mistakes we shouldn't be repeating as well?
Yeah, so I'm glad you mentioned it. It's a global challenge, because it is going to be different based on the region, and we need to focus on what the impact COVID has had on different regions and different countries. Sadly, with most things, COVID has been one of those things that has impacted people very, very differently. It's been a very divisive issue as well in terms of the response and how we come out the other side of it. So we need to consider who it has impacted the most. We've seen, especially in terms of on the global level, certain countries with less developed health infrastructures have really not been able to respond particularly well to it. We have an event coming up in Africa later this month where we'll be trying to connect civil society representatives with politicians to not specifically talk about LGBT equality in isolation, but how the impact of COVID has affected LGBT people, how the impact of COVID has overlapped with other health challenges. So we know that a lot of LGBT people continue to be disproportionately affected by HIV in certain countries. And essentially how we can build those partnerships going forward. So whether that's partnerships between health organisations, civil society, businesses, what role those businesses are playing in terms of the response, employment law. And as a caucus, our priority is to make sure that those partnerships are built on a cross-party basis. So where I mentioned that COVID has been so polarising, we need to make sure that politicians of all stripes are on the same page going forward and are listening to the issues that are affecting LGBT people.
Thank you. We often hear as well from the work we do at the Queer Youth Network as well, from different organizations as well, that the diverse challenges different regions are facing are really important to be mentioned and to be recognized. And we also seen as well, like as you've mentioned, that on one hand, we see a lot of LGBT plus support from politically, but often a lot of young people are saying that this is tokenistic and is not meaningful. And on the other hand, we see the backlash, we see the human rights abuses of LGBTIQ people that are happening, including in Europe, including all across the world as well. So that invisible, that fabricated battleground where like LGBTIQ rights are being used for political gains or for particularly for profit, even including from corporates and organizations, is becoming more prominent in times of pandemic, and is something that young people are really focusing on. I see a question from the chat that I would like to ask you, and builds upon something you all both mentioned, particularly the importance of diversity and representation within our movement. The question is, how can we push an even more diverse LGBTIQ agenda? A valid criticism of our cause is that often it's very privileged individuals who take the place of those who suffer the most. How can we mainstream not only diversity, but also inclusion within our day-to-day actions that we do? So you can be able to see the question as well in the chat, but basically the question asks about as well how we can ensure that not only those of us who are privileged enough to speak without, risking their own lives and their bodily autonomy and risking harm that they may face, are the only voices, but we have diverse voices of people who are facing this on a day-to-day basis. It's a big question as well.
It is a big question, and this might be a bit of a controversial answer. Politics is about power and about what's possible, and it's been compared sometimes to making sausages. You might like some of the outcomes, but you probably don't want to see a lot of the processes that stand behind them. That is an ugly truth, but I think what we can do in our coalitions is try to stand for ethical, inclusive behaviour, and to try to kind of live and model that behaviour as best we can. And I saw this, in politics myself in the early 1990s, before I was a member of parliament, but a civil society activist. In New Zealand, we had a very inadequate and exclusionary human rights statute. Didn't include sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability status, including, if somebody had a disease or a medical condition. And there was a campaign to include disability and sexual orientation in the law. And on the definition of sexual orientation, something was put forward that was not only inadequate, but insulting and potentially quite dangerous. And the disabled activists and members of the community, they were always going to win on getting disability put in. It was popular, much more popular than sexual orientation. And those activists and their leaders stood up and said, look, no, everything goes in and it needs to be appropriate on the sexual orientation front, or we don't want our amendment on disability. And to me, that was one of the most humbling and kind of salutary moments that I've experienced in sort of public or semi-public life. And it's an example as to how we should behave when we go forward on the issues that matter to us.
And Andrew, do you have anything to add as well?
Sort of broadly the same point, I guess. We generally need to be pragmatic about these things. I mean, more often than not, it's the case that change doesn't happen overnight. And in many countries around the world, it is the case that politics is the occupation of the privileged. So we need to accept that in many circumstances, yes, there are people who have been privileged that are taking up space of people that we would rather be seeing included. So in those instances, we need to be thinking about how we're going to get voices around the table that need to be heard, and how do we recognize that some of these people are not being reached. And these cases need to be made to the people in positions of power, i.e. elected office. And those people need to be doing more to get the overlooked voices around the table. So we need to be thinking about who is around the table, how can we reach them, and the need of those in positions of power to be listening to their voices. And ultimately, one day, we hope to be seeing the people that are being neglected will be the people that are around the table and holding elected office. And ultimately, it is the job of elected officials to be representing all their constituents. So aside from simply neglected LGBT voices, there's, as I've said previously, there is often a lot of overlap in terms of the issues that these people are facing. So how do we build alliances with other neglected groups? So for example, women, disabled groups. And that's the kind of thing we seek to be doing in the caucus, to make sure that those voices are around the table and are being connected to elected officials.
Thanks so much, both. I think I have such a long list of other questions that I want to ask you, but unfortunately we don't have enough time to go over them as well. I think we definitely covered a lot of the importance area from your work, and thanks for sharing your experience as well. As Charles mentioned in the beginning, you said it's a lonely journey, but it seems like whilst we have here on the call, we're never going to be lonely in this movement. So I'm great to see a lot of alliances that you've been building as well with different movements from the youth perspective and from the Global Queer Youth Network. It's so important that we work intersectionally, and we see a future that, future is intersectional, is representative of the queer communities and all of their diversity from where they come from, regardless of their identities. And I can see that, the groundwork and the work that you're doing is paving the way for those queer young voices that we'll be hearing in a bit, that will be shaping as well the decision-making in the future, from the design of policy to their implementation. And thank you so much again for joining us. And hope you will be able to stay for the rest of the discussions, and hope we stay connected. So we'll be moving now. Thanks again to Charles and Andrew. There's no clap because it's a Zoom, so we can't do that. But thank you both. And now we're moving to the next section of this panel, as equally exciting part of this conversation we'll be having today. But before that, we'll show you another video that is a great example again of partnership between different agencies, and what we would like to see as well happening more on global level. This video is a new campaign video that is in partnership between the Office of the Secretary General's Envoy on Youth and the Free and Equal campaign to celebrate youth leadership and the ways young LGBTIQ people are changing the world for the better. Great. Hope you enjoyed our video. So this is part of a series of campaigns, and this is the second video actually the Office of the Secretary General's Envoy on Youth and Free and Equal have produced. And again, as I mentioned, this is a great example of how we need to work across agencies and together to be able to amplify queer youth voices. And it's the first time we've seen as well from the queer youth movement such high profile representation of LGBTIQ voices, and hopefully it's just the start as well. So moving to the next exciting as well part of our panel. So in the first one, we did hear about a lot of the LGBTIQ challenges people face in terms of wider representation in political movements, and also some of the good initiatives the UNDP and Global Equality Caucus have been doing as well. In this part, we will focus particularly young people and how meaningfully young LGBTIQ people can be involved in the political spaces. I briefly mentioned earlier as well, so we've seen, you know, on one hand, great support from political parties, but also governments and corporate leaders, but too often that support is tokenistic or is, as we call it as well, sometimes pinkwashing, and is not meaningful in a way that engages young people in a space where they have their voices, but also their needs are being met. And on the other hand, we have the harmful practices and the abuses we see, particularly targeting LGBTIQ rights, youth as well in particular. So we've seen this battleground of LGBTIQ youth rights being used as a political scapegoat and also for political gain and profit. And hence why I have this exciting next panel, which will be tackling how we can do that meaningfully on local, regional, and international level. So one of the goals for the Queer Youth Dialogue is to inspire young LGBTIQ people to take youth-led action and lead the policy conversations that impact their lives. With this in mind, we will now make the conversation about exploring that meaningful participation in political spaces, in particular the barriers to access and the solutions, how we can do that. So I have an amazing group of speakers with me, and to kick us off, it's my great pleasure to invite the Mayor of Bangor from Wales, Owen Hurcomb. They will introduce themselves to share what inspired you to get involved in politics.
Yeah, thanks for having me here. And I just want to say how interesting the previous segment was as well. That was a pleasure to listen to. So as Martin said, I'm Owen Hurcomb. I'm the Mayor of Bangor. My pronouns are they, them. I'm 23 years old, and already people keep asking, you know, to like, oh, you've got your career going in politics. What's all that about? What got you into that? And the answer really is my family. I come from a background in which politics wasn't the family business, but was what was important. On my dad's side, working class South Wales, Sally Army, and on my mum's side, you know, working class, growing up in various places in England. And I was sort of inspired to get into politics and local politics because it feels like the avenue to make the changes. And I like to think I'm doing that. But I'm sure when the questions come in, I can elaborate further on that.
Thank you, Owen, and great to be here, and congratulations again. I think it's a great achievement as well for that position as well in particular. And the next, I would like to introduce the next speaker. That will be Larissa. Over to you to introduce yourself.
Hello, good morning. I suppose it's good afternoon for most of you. Before introducing myself, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to be here sharing a little bit of my experience as a Black, bisexual, and from the Amazon region, and also a little bit of the scenario of LGBT youth in Brazil and what we are facing these days, which is not a light topic. So with that being said, my name is Larissa Pinto Moraes. I'm 25 years old. I have a bachelor degree in psychology. I have a master's in social psychology, and currently I'm living, English is not my native language, so I'm a little bit nervous. And so Currently, I'm working at Engajamundo, that is a youth-led organization, which our core purpose is to provide tools and accessibilized ways so that Brazilian youth understands that by learning and implementing ways to improve themselves and their surroundings, it's possible to make a change in the world. So it's a very exciting job, and it's a very exciting day for me to be here speaking to you guys.
Great to have you as well, and super exciting to hear more from you as well, and a little bit as well to share with your experience in particular. So, and next speaker, I would like to present themselves will be Tashi, and actually we know each other from the Youth Steering Committee at ILGA World. So great to see you, Tashi, here. Over to you.
Thank you for having me. Okay. Sorry, I was driving and I just settled down right now. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Tashi Setan. You can call me Tashi. My pronouns are he, they. I am the current director of Queer Voices of Bhutan. Bhutan, we are a very small nation in Southeast Asia, in Asia. As a part of Queer Voices of Bhutan, what we mainly do is we focus more on advocacy, creating content for LGBTI, and we do more policy advocacy work in the country. I'm also part of Youth Voices Count, which is a youth network for young LGBTI people in Asia and the Pacific, and also a member of the Youth Steering Committee member for ILGA Asia. Good to be here in this space. I look forward to the conversation that we are going to have.
Great. I'm really excited as well having you, three of you here, and we have great conversation. I think it's going to be quite informal one. We'll have some guiding questions, and anyone in that is joining us today, feel free to ask questions in the Q&A as well, option as well. But to start with as well, again, we know that LGBTIQ youth are often sidelined in politics and in decision making on global level. Because often our rights or our identities or who we are being described as too sensitive, too political to be addressed, to be discussed, and we're just not there. We're not being mentioned, not only within the wider political spectrum, but also from within our movements. And within even the LGBTIQ movement, sometimes the youth rights are the too sensitive part to be addressed and discussed, which is a big problem for many of us and many other queer young people across the world, where their voices cannot be presented in these spaces. So what are some of the challenges faced by LGBTIQ people, and from your work and your experience or yourself, to engage in political or civil society spaces? Are there any specific challenging pertaining young people in this regard particularly? So what are the specific ones that are about LGBTIQ young people in particular to engage in political and civil society? So I will go first to Owen. Is that okay?
Yeah, no, I think in terms of the problems that particularly face young LGBTQ plus people in getting into politics and representative politics is, as you said, we are often seen as a political object in and of ourselves, regardless of what we're trying to do. You know, and that comes with a lot of pressure. It's not political that I'm non-binary. It just happens that I'm non-binary. Yet suddenly everyone sees it as part of my agenda. I whatever I'm doing, I'll be talking about bins. It's what we do on local councils, and somebody will be talking about, oh, how does that relate to your queer agenda? And people just aren't educated, and that has a huge impact, and especially when you're young as well, because we're all seen as these young revolutionaries, and okay, some of us are, but we're also just trying to get on and do what we can to support a community. We're not, you know, out there being crazy or being all over the place, but people just think we're young, we're naive, it will pass, you'll do all this and you'll do all that, and it really stops meaningful conversations happening. Because what I want to do in local politics, particularly in Bangor, is one of the things I want to do is keep a local food share scheme we've got going on. That's something I'm putting a lot of pride and energy into. And yet, oh no, you're young and you're just doing it because you're getting your name out there because you want to be one of these queer elders and all that. And there's just a lot of doubt placed upon you because people mistake the identity we have as being inherently political, which it isn't, which it shouldn't be. And they also therefore assume that every decision we take is always about that queer politics. And I think that can stop a lot of us being advocates in other areas of political interest as well.
Thanks. Thank you so much. And Larissa, do you want to as well share particularly from your experience as well with the organization?
Sure. I think adding from what Owen brought, I would say that we have a serious problem with invisibilizing. I don't think I don't know if I'm pronouncing the word correctly. Our voices. So in Brazil in particular, we have a serious issue with prejudice against LGBT people. And I think we as young people with a different perspective and a different background, we have a lot to contribute to the conversation. But most of the times, older people turn to us and say, shush, you don't know what you're talking about. And this is, I think it's a big problem because we also have a perspective to what we are saying. We have a trajectory to this. So the fact that people don't listen to what we are saying is a really big problem. And this is part of the job we do at Engajamundo, try to enlarge or to accessibilize places so youth people can talk about their issues and can talk about how they plan to face their issues, because it's also kind of a prejudice or deal that youth people don't know what they're talking about and they don't have solutions to their problems, that they just know how to, sorry, I was almost saying a curse word, but they just know how to complain about things. So I think this is related to youth, I think this is one of the worst things that we face here in Brazil.
Yeah, I can't agree more. You often hear as well, I think in terms of like international organizations as well, is in terms of everyone is like, I'm adding the youth there as tokenism, and not recognizing it, like, oh yeah, youth is just one identity of all the identities I have, right? I'm actually also like, expert in this. I'm like, like you mentioned, like, psychiatrist, I'm also like a politician. I am this, and it's like this kind of other elements of you suddenly disappear and you're seen as just this one entity of being young, and that's it. And young is prejudiced, associated too often by being inexperienced, incapable, too naive, and times like this, being told that you're too naive to bring radical change to solve the issues is really degrading statement, and it can be very demotivating for all of us to do that. Speaking of that, moving to Tashi, actually, who can bring as well some particular challenges. I know some of the great work you've done, and you will be talking a little bit more about it later as well, particularly in Bhutan. But what are the challenges you think that queer young people face in engaging in political representation?
Thank you, Martin. I would agree with your previous point. I think one of the issues that we have in our country is being young itself is an issue, right? Because being young is labeled as being inexperienced. So Bhutan recently became a democratic country, which means it's just been 13 years in Bhutan. So we only changed 3 governments so far. The third one is in the running right now. So so it has been a very new step for us, not just for queer people, but for everyone in general, I guess. So but one of the perceptions that we have in Bhutan is that the representatives or the elected representatives or those seats, the candidacy seats, right, for people who, it's more like a post-retirement job for bureaucrats, right? After their government tenure is over, then they can come into politics. So that's how it is seen. That's how it has been seen over a few years. It's also about popularity vote. How famous are you on the social media, or how loud are you? You don't have to be really socially progressive. As long as you're loud and people know you, then you can become a member of a party and get into politics. So that's the perception that we have right now. And in terms of queer visibility, it's a very touchy subject in Bhutan. We just had decriminalization 6 months ago, so freshly decriminalized country, and the whole LGBTI and queer issue in general is a very touchy subject, as well as the topic of human rights is sometimes very frowned upon when we do advocacy works in the country itself. So you can imagine how queer spaces would be, right? And there's this perception of having this nuclear family. Our voters generally don't look at your background. They don't care how much education you had, where you studied, or who you represented. They will look at who's your husband or wife is, how many children you have, or who are your parents, whether they're influential in the district, whether they're influential in the places. So that's the background that voters generally look at. So I think these are the common issues that we have right now. We have far longer way to go in terms of changing our attitude towards democracy itself. And I think having queer representation in this whole political space is going to be challenging, but not impossible. So we just have to take one step at a time and not lose focus in general.
Great, thank you, Tashi. Speaking of that as well, like we talked about, or we talk about some of the challenges in general that usually exist for queer young people, but we know also that COVID has made them worse, right? And we've seen like backsliding of this progress that was made in some areas. We've seen as well, Larissa, talk about the importance of safe spaces, you know, and spaces for like queer young people to like, you know, be able to mobilize and advocate. But unfortunately, we've seen with COVID is that closure of more spaces. We've seen that youth-led queer civil society and organizations, which before the pandemic were like underfunded, relying on volunteers, were hit even harder, and many of them had to close or disappear. So like the support available has been really reduced. We've seen more homelessness, we've seen more mental health problems amongst LGBTIQ people from across the world where data is being still conducted. We started to see that. We've seen how in particularly trans and non-binary young people particularly impacted in terms of accessing vital healthcare services all across the world, including the US, and how the rights are being used for political purposes. So we've seen these attacks and we've seen the lack of services and support. So there's a big question here, and it's that how we can get more young people to get involved into the politics, recognizing that, you know, the current climate is really toxic and politics can be abusive and unsafe space. So there is this impossible dilemma that sometimes sits amongst young people, is that how can I, like, you know, advocate for my own rights? Shall I advocate for my own rights, right, and risk harm, or like, you know, or stay back and silent and then see this all happening before me? So that's the impossible dilemma. But are there any ways, you know, we can do that in the toxic and really dangerous climate that we're working in, that we can engage more young people in politics? So I'll start this time with Larissa.
Okay, as you said, it's a difficult question. And I think we have several layers to this question and also for an answer. And I probably won't be able to tackle all of them. But I think the first thing that comes to my mind is that a hostile place to LGBTQ people. It's not something new to us. I think what we're facing now is that we are being able to talk a lot more about the situation. We are creating new ways to talk about this and to think about ways to face it. And for people from the outside, I think it seems like it's a new issue or is a bigger issue, but I think we are not facing something new. We are facing something that maybe changed a bit, but it's not something new to us. And regarding the other layers about this, I think we have to think about how we can construct safe spaces and how we can mobilize enough people so we have a seat at the table for discussion. I think Oscar and Andrew, and no Oscar, sorry. I forgot the name, Charles, yes, thank you. Charles and Andrew said the previous panel, a lot of the things that contribute to the situation we're living in. And for instance, Engajamundo, one of the reasons why this organization was created was so that we could guarantee the participation of youth from the global south, especially from Brazil, in international decision-making spaces, because we understood that we had something to contribute to the conversation. And the decisions that were being made about our future were being made without our presence. So I think this is one point that we can think about, how we can access this kind of places and how we can make so that we be heard about people that are making the decisions, because that is the core point, I believe. And also how we can engage more people to the conversation. So how we can accessibilize the conversation, how we can make the language and politics more, I wouldn't say fun, but more relatable from our day to day, how we can intersectionalize our conversation. So we have a big community, LGBT. It's not a simple community, it's not a unique community. So how we can also intersectionalize the LGBT agenda with other agendas like the Black movement and so on. Sorry, I said a lot.
No, you haven't at all. Your points were all great and really well said. Yeah, and definitely about merging with other movements, with Black Lives Matter, with reproductive movements and others. And it's something we've seen, with climate justice movements, that, queer movements are already there at the heart of some of these, but we just need to find ways to work together. And one thing you mentioned, I can't agree more as well, is that this is not new. And, often we present this as a new era. Yes, a lot of things have been made worse, but queer young people, before lockdowns and before this, they lived in isolation. We've lived through isolations, social isolations, condemnations from our communities and discriminations. We've been pushed into the sidelines before, into our social lockdowns from services and from communities. So it's important, I think, what you said. It's really, and I think leads to, I'm going to go to Owen now as well, if you want to add particularly something about this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with all the points Larissa mentioned. I think another set of barriers, another things that we've got to talk about to make it accessible is just understanding that it isn't going to be easy and knowing that it's going to be hard. And that's why I think a support network is so important. And it's why COVID has hit doubly hard. I mean, yes, it's great to have an online community of LGBTQ plus people you can interact with. And when I was in the closet, the online community I was out to, albeit anonymously, was really important. And online communities are good, but we need that physical community and support there. Because if we want to get involved in politics, suddenly we put a target on our back. Ostensibly, I live in a country that supports LGBTQ plus people. That's what the government line is. And yet the government won't recognize non-binary people. But even beyond that, hate crimes in this country are massively on the rise. People have been, openly gay people have been murdered on the street, and the police's response to it was maybe don't wear your headphones and don't look too gay. And just this morning I woke up to the news that a Pride festival in Milton Keynes had its rainbow arch burnt to the ground overnight in an arson attack. And so there's a lot of stuff going on, even in a country ostensibly as supportive as mine. And I'm expected that. As the mayor, I have and receive and still do get hundreds upon thousands of messages, abusive messages. And my support network is so important to me in getting us through that. And I think getting LGBTQ plus youth people into politics, once they overcome the barriers of being young themselves, is knowing that unfortunately they are putting themselves out there into a world that doesn't want to be or isn't ready for them. And a support network is key for that. And I think coming out of COVID, having those physical support networks is going to be vital. And I think the more that we can have, the more young people will get in politics. And then ultimately, if we get enough young LGBTQ plus people in politics, we won't need the support networks anymore, because we would have changed the face of politics and the dynamic of the world.
Yes, and we can all like hope that it's going to be soon rather than later. But yeah, and Tashi, do you want to add something as well to what Rita and Owen have said so far? I'm afraid we can't hear you.
I think they covered most of the things, right? What Larissa and Owen said makes totally sense to everyone. For places where we don't really have this political visibility in terms of queer movement, so yeah, that's where we essentially are right now. So having that space makes a lot of sense. Maybe not to all of them, but to some of us, definitely yes. And safe spaces are not just your physical spaces. Maybe it can be online, it can be virtual, it can also be global spaces where we stand up for each other in this times right now.
Great, thank you. So a little bit of like reformulate my first question, and if there are other questions, so please feel free to use the Q&A. But we've seen a lot of us are rejecting formal politics. The way that politics as a system is constructed, the wider socioeconomic system that is currently failing us as next generations, and is failing the generation after us as well. And we've seen that, with the climate crisis, we're seeing with COVID, we're seeing it with human rights abuses, and now we're seeing it with Afghanistan as well, how really the political leadership is failing, and it has been failing for a while. And we've seen a lot of young people rejecting that and standing up to it as well, and looking for alternative forms of organizing and pushing for social change. So what do you think is the future of decision making? What it looks like and what it should look like? It's a big question, but into this, looking into what's currently happening, looking at maybe knowing that we don't have much time left to create new forms of engagement and social change. What do you think it should look like, and how maybe we can try to get there? Big question, but this time we'll start around Tashi.
Sorry, is that me?
Yes, sorry, I hope you heard. Yeah, did you hear the question? I can repeat as well.
Yeah, so yeah, I was just contemplating because like you said, it's a very big question.
Yeah, I know.
I think in an ideal world, or in an ideal world, in an ideal situation, I would love seeing having everyone represented, right? Like in a situation where we don't really have to have this conversation that we are having right now. We are having this conversation because there is an issue here, and there's a problem, and there are a lot of things to do around this kind of issue. So we are doing this because yeah. I think it's a very broad question, and I got confused in midway.
Don't worry, and I think your connection was a little bit interrupting, so I didn't hear. Maybe it was my connection as well, but I didn't hear. But take some time. You don't have to. So, anyone else that wants to bring maybe some insight on this? I know it's a big question. If you have, I know Owen, maybe being now into political landscape, right, and you're seeing how dated UK political system is, even on local level, and how bureaucratic and it is. What do you wish it was a bit different, and what you wish you want to see it changing so you can respond really adequately to the issues that we are facing?
It needs a complete overhaul. I enjoy the line that the world is failing future generations, mainly because it's not just failing future generations, it's been failing every single generation since the political decision makers decided that human life was worth less than money, which is the bedrock of the entire global political climate right now. It doesn't matter what system we have, until we unlearn that human life has finite value, then we're never going to get anywhere. And yes, I know all about archaic political institutions. I mean, I have to be paraded into meetings when they're full council meetings in my full regalia behind somebody holding a ceremonial mace, and people have to stand up to speak to me. And I just think it's rather weird and rather strange. And yeah, that's an anachronistic thing of UK local council, but it happens all the way up. And I think in an ideal world, we wouldn't be making top-down decisions, or we wouldn't be making decisions based upon some kind of fictitious bottom line, because we've invented money to give the well-off a better time while standing upon everyone else's work and labour. And in an ideal world, decisions would be made from the bottom up. We'd be huge decentralisation and delegation down to local levels, and we'd empower local organisations, elected organisations, free and open elections, to make those decisions, and they would have to be respected. And I think that's the only way it can work. And we've also got to get to a stage where we can work with each other. I mean, obviously we can't work with people who fundamentally disagree with our existence. I like to think that I will work with pretty much anyone, but as soon as somebody goes, well, actually, I don't really get the LGBs and the T's and all that alphabet soup, then I'm like, yeah, no, we can't work together. But we've got to get to a position where we can start bringing together a big group of people to work on all issues. As Lucia said, it is intersectional with all the other struggles we're facing right now. And the only way to ensure this planet is safe for future generations of not just queer youth, but all people, is to work together and build from the bottom up, and fundamentally to respect that human life is worth more than any amount of money. And I think that has to be the bedrock.
Thank you. And Larissa, you want to add more to this one as well?
I think I want to share something.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's an answer per se.
It doesn't have to be an answer. Yeah, I'm not expecting you to solve the biggest question of our lifetimes. So no, it's just a reflection and some thoughts. Yeah.
But in Brazil, we are seeing an interesting movement of civil society and young people to bring marginalized bodies in the political arena. And this movement started especially after the assassination of Marielle Franco, a councilwoman in Rio de Janeiro in 2018. In process of political education, mobilization, platforms that connected voters to candidates, we have, I think we have a platform that is really incredible, that is Vote LGBT. There is a platform made by young people to connect the agendas of LGBT young people to representative places. And so I believe that we are in a tipping point, I think, with possibilities to innovation, even in the face of such a destructive scenario as the one we are experiencing with the Bolsonaro government. Is a very, very difficult moment we are living in Brazil right now, but I think we can see tips of hope. I like to see that in that way. In the last municipal elections, we have 90 LGBT candidates elected, and among 30 transgender people. We have indigenous people being elected mayors. It's a major step for us. We have young people being elected. We have collectives that are being elected as representatives. There is an innovation for our policymaking and representation. So I don't think we are with all the answers right now, but I think we have, and I'm optimistic like that, we have a little bit of hope, because we have people that still believe that it's possible to make a change in the world. And I think with that thought, we can really make some change. Not all the change we want, but I think we can start something different.
Thank you. That was better than an answer. That was examples, and yeah, and it's like, yeah. Thank you. I want to go to Tashi if you want to say something, if your internet is good, but don't worry. Might have. Oh, I just want to check if you want to add something, Tashi, or if you have an internet connection.
Sorry, it's by the way, it's evening, so everyone's on the internet. So, I think Larissa covered a lot of it, so I think I'm okay for the right now.
Yeah, thank you. And so I have, there's loads of questions I would like to ask you, but unfortunately we have very limited time again, and we would like now to ask you as your final thoughts that you would like to share, and you've talked briefly about the challenges that LGBTIQ youth face. We talked about the opportunities and some of your work as an example of what small changes can make a big difference really in the certain climates that we are facing. And particularly, we talked about this is nothing new. We talked about that this has been for a while, and the challenges we're facing have just been exacerbated, but are not new. We've talked about the importance of safe spaces and the importance of intersectionality and representation within the movement, and how to work with other movements that are not necessarily directly linked with the work we're doing, but important to find the common ground to do that. And I would like to, what would be the best advice that you would give to LGBTIQ youth who are aspiring, maybe are watching now, or like are thinking of becoming the next leaders of the world and getting involved in politics, but their country and the environment they're facing is quite hostile, and they're facing multiple barriers for them to be accepted and celebrated as who they are. So what is your advice to those young people who might be like watching now, or who might hear you later when this is shared, that despite the challenges they are facing right now and things, they still aspire to be the leaders of tomorrow or today? So I will start first with Larissa.
So I think I would say find your people. They will make the journey less lonely and more loud, reaching more people. And remember, transformation doesn't always have to be a major thing. Juliana Borges, a Brazilian researcher that I really like, wrote on a paper in 2015, I guess, that a happy Black woman is a revolutionary act. And in a way, I believe that we can adapt this sentence and place alongside a Black woman every discarded and marginalized body, including LGBT people. Because just by being alive and hopefully happy in the way that we can be happy nowadays, and aspiring to make a change in this crazy, crazy world, I think we are already making a difference. So find your people and be safe, be happy as much as you can. I think that would be my message.
Thank you, Larissa. And Andrew, maybe if you're still with us, if you want to share as well.
Yeah, broadly the same advice as Larissa, I guess. First and foremost, I would say to stay safe, like never put yourself in danger and put yourself out of the way in achieving what you're looking to achieve. Next, I would say organize. So connect with local LGBT groups or local support groups and engage with their activism and their networks. Look for role models. So anyone in your country who is already an out political leader, or has anybody come out and been a leader in this regard in similar countries or taken a similar path. Find a mentor. So if you're seeking political office, it is hard work and it's a taxing job. So it would be good to be speaking with someone who has already trodden that path. So make sure that you have someone who you can look up to, who can give you advice and support. And finally, build coalitions with other movements seeking change. So connect with women's rights groups, connect with disabled rights groups, connect with trade unions. Because ultimately you are never alone and the support is there. So you just need to find it.
Thank you, Andrea. And Tashi, if you want to share. Maybe we'll go first to you, Charles.
Sure. Look, I probably am the odd person out here as somebody who's definitely not a young activist anymore, not by many years. But maybe that would help to give a little bit of perspective, which I'd like to share first as one of my sort of key messages here. These are many of the questions that we've been discussing are really, really important, especially the ones around how we work inside our own communities to ensure that we are fully inclusive and representative. But can I just say, it's an amazing discussion to be having, and it's so different to the sort of discussions around basic inclusion that we used to have 20, 30 years ago when we were fighting for, things as self-evident to many of us now, like decriminalization, although Tashi reminds us that in many places this is still a recent development, and in many other places it still hasn't happened. I guess the point is, rapid change and quite deep change is possible. And over my political career, as I said before, we went in New Zealand from decriminalization in 1986 through to marriage equality, and now repeal of the laws around so-called conversion therapy. That's a short space of time. It's a generation, and we've seen a country go from extremely homophobic to extremely inclusive. So change is possible, but it's only possible, as many of you have been saying, if we are smart about the way we work and operate and build coalitions. Unlike, for example, the women's movement, we're never going to be in the majority or near the majority. So we're always going to need our allies, and we're always going to need to be really clever about building coalitions and persuading people of the value of the arguments around our inclusion and our rights. And despite all the setbacks that we see around the world, the populist politicians who would use us and denigrate us in order to advance their own narrow and selfish interests, the trends are in our favor. And I thought, Larissa, what you said about the contrast in Brazil between, the centre having had a setback and having gone reactionary, while at the local level and at the state level, people are just coming forward in huge numbers. And that demonstrates that, again, the trend is in the right way, even if we feel sometimes a little bit nonplussed about the outlying regressions or lack of progress. And finally, you know, just to echo something Andrew just said, we are not alone. There are so many more allies and so many more places to look for support and assistance and solidarity than there were even 10 years ago, let alone 20 or 30 years ago. So let's make sure that we keep supporting each other, be smart, be inclusive, and you know, be the change that we want and need to see.
Great words, Charles, and thank you so much. Just want to check with Tashi if you're here, if you have connection. Do you want to share your final thoughts and advice?
Yeah. Sorry, I'm having this internet issues. Okay. In my experience, so if you are a local activist and you want to work nationally, and if you really don't have a community to stand back on, right? Like we didn't have. So what we did was we stood on our allies. So like what Melissa just said, Larissa, right, just said, find your people. So if you can't find your people within the community, find your people in the allies, find the people in the politician or in the spaces that you work with. That usually works, but it should never come. But your safety should be your utmost priority. I think that's the key essential that we forget. And if you are just starting up, and if you're just new to these spaces I would say just don't be afraid. Just take the first step. For us, we did not have pioneers. We didn't really have activists leading this LGBTI movement for us. We had to start on our own with the resources that we have. So find your spaces, find your people, and find your resources at the end. I think if you have good intentions, everything works out. It may not be very immediate, but if you have patience and you work consistently, then it does pay off in the longer run.
Thank you, Tashi. And finally, Owen?
Yeah, so echoing what everyone has said, your personal safety is of the utmost importance. But both in terms of being at risk from other people, but looking after your own mental health as well, that's a huge thing. Find your people, yes, so you can sort of set up this organization, set up the community activism, but find your people. So if you've had a taxing day, you can chill out with them, have some chocolate, kick back, whatever it means you need to do to relax, because it's very easy to be totally consumed in what you're doing. And while you might be doing fantastic work, a victory is not worth the pain that it can cause you if you don't look after yourself while achieving it, because the victories will come and we will get there as a community with our allies and with our support. But you have to be able to get there looking after yourself as well. And you know, outwardly being the acceptance you're hoping to create in the country is fantastic. And if you can stand up and do that, just know that you need somebody to be there around you to support you, especially if you fall, because that could happen, and you need that group of people there looking after each other. You know, it's all about that solidarity.
Thank you, Owen, as well. And thank you so much. I can't express how much really I'm grateful that I could moderate this call with so many inspiring speakers today. And I'm really, really pleased that you could come and share some of your experiences, but also some of your opinions about the future of decision making as well. We've seen during this call really that it's more important than ever really to center young people in general in the decision making process, and particularly those young people that were excluded for too long in the decision making, and their voices were missing on local, regional, international level. To see how queer young people can be meaningfully involved in decision making is really important. And some of you shared the great examples of the importance of creating spaces for where they can, you know, advocate with the right tools and resources, advocate for their own issues that they face, and work with political leaders so they are represented in the decision making and the future and the future challenges they're facing. We've seen the importance of funding youth-led initiatives and how they need to be supported so they can grow and progress and become new models and alternative forms of mobilizing and calling for social change. We've seen also that young people really need to be respected, not only as, you know, as young people, but also as experts in their own areas, as people who bring so much more from diverse fields, and be acknowledged for their contribution as well into that field. And we've mentioned as well the importance of allyship and working cross sectors, working with other movements from diverse places, that we can break down the barriers, and the important task of the current leaders, that they need to make sure to create the space and break the barriers that have been existed for too long for those that are missing around the table. We are not political battleground as queer young people, and our rights are not controversial or political. Our bodies will be and always will be our own, and our lives are not for profit, as you mentioned, or less worthy. By centering queer young people at the future of decision making, well, I'm sure that, you know, together we'll be able to build a more fair, just, sustainable world where, like, each young person's body, rights, and lives are protected and respected. And I'm sure with great people around the table like you, together we'll do that. So thank you so much again for joining this call and for being part of the Queer Youth Dialogues. Remember, this is a year-long campaign, so we hope you continue to join us for the next sessions. And then together we can continue to build a stronger global youth movement for LGBTIQ human rights with more resources, support, and power. Please follow our social media channels for more information. If you're a young person, sign up for the Queer Youth Network mailing list via the website. We're sharing the link about it just right now in the chat. And again, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope to see you in the future series of the Queer Youth Dialogue.